Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board.
Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing.
Nonprofit resources.
The Alliance for Nevada Nonprofits presents Nonprofit Everything, the podcast about everything nonprofit, with your host, Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I'm Andy Shurick.
Stacey Wedding.
And we're here to answer all of your questions about nonprofit stuff. We're presented by the Alliance for Nevada Nonprofits, and here we go.
Our nonprofit was approached by a new family-owned restaurant that is opening soon, and they said they will give a portion of the opening night proceeds to us if we can get at least 100 of our contacts to come. They've asked for our logo so they can help promote this. Do you have experience with these types of arrangements, and is there anything we should know?
So, this reminds me of is back in the 80s, if you had a band and you wanted to play at a particular bar or club, you would go to the club and you'd think it would be on merit that they'd listen to your demo tape and they'd want the best band. They'd pick the best bands who had the coolest music and they'd want them. But what they want is the bands that have the biggest fan base so that they can fill the club.
Of course.
So that they can buy as many drinks as possible. So what the club would do is they'd be like, yeah, totally. You guys can have the 8 o'clock slot on Friday. You just have to sell 100 tickets. And you can pay us in advance for the tickets, and then you can sell them for whatever you want or give them away free or whatever. So it's basically pay to play, which is terrible. And, and no band, some bands did that because they wanted to be, you want to play on the Sunset Strip or whatever. But this sounds a lot like that to me.
It does. Oh, those good old 80s, yeah.
Yeah. The big caveat here is that I don't know. I don't think I would agree with this one. I don't think if somebody asked me if you want to do that, I would say no.
And why would you say that?
It's too vague. So they said they're going to give. Maybe they do have more information and they just didn't put it in the question. So they said they're going to give us a portion of the proceeds. So what's
How
that?
How much?
Yeah. What is that? 1%? What are you going to give us? What's a portion of the proceeds? And then if I don't get to 100 people, if I can't get 100 people, am I getting nothing? So if I get 98, are you not going to give me anything?
Right. And then how do you track who, quote, our contacts are, right, as the nonprofit versus you as the restaurant? Is there some little postcard or little email that then you've got to try to not only message it to your constituents and stakeholders, but then make sure that they take in the little, symbol or emblem to say that they're connected to our organization.
Right. Yeah. I guess the big question is why does this make sense for your donors? So if the donors are, if you're using your contact list and it's people that are interested in your organization and your mission, let's say it's 10%. So you're asking them to go eat dinner. If they've got kids, it's like $50, and you're going to get $5. So why don't you just ask them for $5 instead? And then they don't have to go find
easier.
This new restaurant, which could be terrible, and then feel like they were used. So there's a lot of things that are wrong with it. The one way I do see this, a similar situation, is sometimes organizations, and it's usually like PTO, parent-teacher organizations and things like that, will have, they'll go to a fast casual restaurant and they will say, bring this flyer in with you on whatever day. Yeah. And if you eat dinner and then hand this flyer to the waitress or waiter afterwards, we will take 10% of whatever you paid, and they will take that, give that to that organization. So there's no minimum. How much percentage you're going to get. There's no minimum that you have to reach. There's that tracking piece is kind of built in. It's still kind of I can see the desire for nonprofits to do that because it seems like kind of a low impact fundraising method.
Yes.
But it's probably not going to be really efficient and successful.
I think nonprofits get excited about the idea of easy money because we all know how hard it is to raise money. And yet I think there's also such a thing as this concept of donor fatigue where donors or your constituents are only going to listen to you so much. So you've got to be really thoughtful and strategic about how many times do you reach out to them? What are you reaching out to them for? What are you asking them for? And when does that become too much? And there comes a point, I don't know if you're like this. Sometimes I will get so many of these kinds of promotions from organizations, I just start to hit delete before I even open it because I'm like, I'm
not doing it.
Not doing it, right? Or I have my favorite restaurant or whatever. So I also think logo use, you have to be super careful with this kind of stuff because in some ways you're starting to align your nonprofit brand with this company. And so to your point, what if the service sucks or what if the food is really bad and now your logo is tied to it? And while people realize it's not you, but you've still aligned yourself. So to some degree that detail gets lost in people and they just think about you affiliated with this other organization. And so I think there's a lot. You even want kind of like logo guidelines. I'm a huge believer on these things of getting stuff in writing that says like, here's a third party agreement. Here's what, this like kind of your roles are. Here's what our roles are. Here's what we both promise each other. I'm a believer. I know I think I'm an attorney at heart, even though I'm not one, but I believe in that, right? Because it kind of makes it clear for everybody on what they're getting into.
Yeah, it's a good idea. And I think, for this particular thing, I don't know that I would recommend this one.
No,
it sounds
I
like
wouldn't.
there are too many problems with it, but there's so many other opportunities that people.
And there are some good ones.
Yeah, and it's up to you again. So putting on my corporate social responsibility hat for just a second, it's up to the nonprofit to come back with a new negotiating position. So when somebody says, "Hey, we're opening a new restaurant. Do you want to do this?" Take that as their first offer. I mean, so if you've got a better idea and you're like, well, this is how they do it at this place. Like, we can do it this way, or why don't you just advertise yourself? And we're happy to do a couple of social media posts on your behalf, but don't make us make the people show up and make them bring in a flyer. Just give us 10% of the proceeds, or 2%, or whatever it is, and then we'll thank you for it. Absolutely. So you can always take that as sort of like their first offer. And you don't have to take their first offer. You can always come back and say, so what are you really trying to achieve? Are you trying to fill the restaurant? Are you trying to be social? Or what are you doing? What do you want to do this for?
There's kind of opportunity for a larger discussion and maybe larger partnership in some way. And I think instead of closing the door, it's an opportunity to open the dialogue, as you're saying, and sort of look at how can this be a win-win for both organizations. I've also encouraged some of the organizations I work with that get approached to do a lot of this, because it does tend to be the ones that are have bigger name brands. You don't tend to find companies always aligning with the little nonprofit that no one's heard of. They want the ones, back to your 80s analogy, right? They want the ones that have a big reach. But as a point to that, there's also some regulations maybe to set up of what makes this worth our while as a nonprofit? Do we need to get $1,000 from them of the revenue or proceeds? And so I've actually had organizations that have said that to when they get into these agreements, saying we'll do A, B, and C. Can't make any guarantees, but at the end of the day, because we're putting forward our effort, you guarantee us at least $1,000, or and if it's larger than that, great, but at least a minimum of that 1,000. So then it's kind of that the company's in it just as much as you're in it. And I don't know what you think companies would think about something like that, Andy, but I know a few nonprofits who've actually kind of played a little hardball with it and said, no, we're not just your marketing hat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our nonprofit is a few years old, and our annual budget is just under $250,000. Is it necessary to get a formal audit on our financials every year, even given how small we are? Would it make us more appealing to funders?
It might. The rule of thumb generally is if you're doing about $250,000 a year, you can get what's just called a review. So you can hire an accounting firm to come out and just review your financials. It's not a full audit, but they'll look at it and just say that, yep, those look like financials.
And I'm guessing that's less money?
It is a lot less money because they're not actually digging into the details. They're not like affirming that they've looked at it and everything looks okay. Instead, they're just looking at it and saying, we've looked at it. The audit is a much bigger process. And usually if your organization is about $1 million a year or more, $1 million is a good time to think about probably doing an audit. The thing that's going to catch you up, though, is that funders start asking for audits, and they don't care how big you are. So you could be a teeny tiny organization. If you're going for a grant, one of the things the grant might ask you for is a financial audit. So you may want to look at it sooner if you're going to start relying on those bigger funders or the funders that are going to look for an audit. Because a lot of times, you know how these grant applications work. They don't give you the opportunity to explain that you're not quite big enough for an audit. They just want a binary condition. They want, have
Yes.
you included the audit?
Checkbox, right?
Yeah, they want to checkbox it. And that's up to, for the rest of us, that's for us to work with the grantors and the funders to be able to say, there's really shades of gray there that you need to be thinking about.
I have seen exceptions with nonprofits who are, smaller organizations and have had that, the item on the grant application that asks for the audit. And because they have a relationship with the funder, or they were able to submit a question, can I submit such and such instead of an audit, a financial review or our 990 or our policies and procedures. And there's occasionally I've found funders are willing to work with it. But to your point, a lot of times it's hard to even have that communication with the funder, and you just automatically are disqualified. Philosophically, I also think there's something to be said, and about sort of, if you want to be taken seriously, sometimes you've just got to invest and bite the bullet. And I know that's tough. That's tough to swallow because audits are not inexpensive, but sometimes it's about making that investment for your future, which hopefully will lead to people taking you more seriously, funders taking you more seriously, and hopefully more money if those audit results are good.
Yeah, and there are benefits to it. It's not just like back when you were in high school and you would have someone check your homework. It feels like that, but what it's actually doing is it's giving you a lot of information about the kinds of things that other nonprofits are doing, other organizations are doing, so that you can learn from them. So you'll strengthen your internal controls. Like, there's no audit that anyone's ever gone through that the auditor has not said that you could have stronger internal controls, and that actually protects you from having people steal from you. And learning those things, that makes you a stronger organization. So they're good to have regardless. And that's, it kind of falls back to that sort of a nonprofit starvation cycle too, where you want to spend what the bare minimum is to be able to get by.
Yeah.
And it seems like a luxury. If you don't have to do it, why would you do it? But it really does make you up your game.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a side question to this, I think I've read somewhere that if you get federal dollars that are something like $500,000 or more a year, if you're getting that much in funding, which obviously wouldn't be the case for this, but then you're required to get some special audit from the federal, to satisfy sort of the federal mandates. Is that the case? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that's called the single audit. Sometimes people call it the A122, some people call it the A133, some people call it the single audit. But basically, and they just upped it. It used to be $500,000. Now, thankfully, it's $750,000.
Okay.
So if you receive money that originates at a federal agency, regardless of how it gets to you, if it originates at a federal agency, it might go through the state, it might go through a local grantor, but if it's federal dollars and you get $750 in aggregate, it doesn't have to come from just one source. If you get, 10 people giving you $75,000 and it adds up to $750,000, you need to do the single audit, and it is not fun, and it is very expensive, and theoretically, it is not as bad as it would be if you had to do an audit for each one of the federal agencies that you're getting money from, if you're getting it from multiple, right? So technically it's probably less onerous than that, but it is really detailed. You absolutely want to get somebody that's done that before. You don't want to, just your regular old CPA audit they might, if they haven't done a single audit before, you might want to find somebody that has, because there's a lot to it. And it's just recently changed too. They changed a couple of the rules around things like overhead and some other stuff. So you want to know what all the tips and tricks are for that too, and they can help you with that.
Good advice. When you are interviewing a new board member, at what point do you explain the financial giving the person is expected to give?
You're already too late. Because in this one, the question says that when you're interviewing a new board member, it means that you've brought them on, or you're at least, they're a new board member, right? So they're new. And then you're going to explain that there may be a financial giving component. That's something that you need to talk to them about during the process of explaining what your organization is and the kinds of things it needs and the kinds of board members that you expect to have, right?
Absolutely.
So there's definitely a time for a board orientation. You want to have a really robust orientation process where you explain all the programs and everything that you're doing and all the nuances that you don't necessarily get just as an external observer. But the conversation about, is it a give or get board needs to happen far before that person's actually on board. You need to talk to them about it while they're still considering it.
Yeah, it's funny because I think that's just one of those our worst nightmares, right? Is you get into something and then realize, oh, here's 5 more things you didn't hear about in the interview process because we really just wanted to get you on the board, and now you get to see the reality. That's not a great way to start a relationship with a board member.
No, but that's kind of weird though, and I think that's. I mean, in my experience with boards is that would never actually happen because the board member would ask early on, would say, hey, so first of all, they're going to say no. They're going to go, I'm already overcommitted.
Right,
I got a lot of
right.
other things to do. And then the second thing they're asked is, well, okay, if we're going to consider this, what's the time commitment like? And is there a financial commitment? Those are the first 2 questions I usually get. So I'm not quite sure how this question even exists.
So it's interesting that you say that because I'm of the same mindset as you, and yet I have found this to be true, especially with people who've never served on a board before.
Oh.
That don't even realize they have the right to ask those questions, and that it's almost a privilege to be, if they look at it that way, it's a privilege to be sort of asked or courted through this process. And so I've had those people that have said, is it okay to ask, if what the time commitment is or what they're expecting of me? And I'm like, absolutely. So I think for people maybe who've never done it before, there's huge opportunity to sort of educate them along the way. So I could see where it could happen maybe innocently and no one meant any harm. But then it's like, yikes, okay, now there's a disconnect.
Yeah. So I guess what was the original question though is at what point do you explain the financial giving after they've already become a board member? I guess it would happen during the orientation process. If you have a board orientation.
Yeah, if you even know it. I mean, I know several organizations that haven't even sort of solidified this themselves, so this never comes up. And then that becomes an issue when you're a nonprofit board member for a while and this give and get wasn't an expectation and now it becomes one, then that's a whole other conversation that I think probably is more common in the nonprofit sector of, okay, we've grown to the size we're going to implement this give and get.
Yeah, the boards that I've been on or been working with that get to that point where they have to start talking about a give or get once they're a bigger board, I'm always surprised that it's usually unanimous. The board, once you start talking about it, once you can sort of wrangle what number feels comfortable with everybody does want to do it. So but we should let people ask this question. So we've given you 2 questions to seed us with next time. So one of them is, how do you implement a give or get policy on a board? You should ask us that one. The second one you should ask us is, what's a board orientation and what should that include?
And if you could see us, we're giving you a wink, wink here. So yes, there's some future questions.
Shoot those to us. We're happy to answer. Yeah, we've got a list of questions we really want people to ask us. So we're looking
burning.
For them. We're waiting
burning
for them.
it. Yes.
Okay, here's one that's absolutely for you, Stacey. It starts, hi, I'm planning our annual executive staff retreat and looking for a fun activity to do as a team building activity. Any suggestions?
Well, each group is different and each group has a different personality. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. And so my response back would be that perhaps it's not up to one person to decide that, but maybe you can have a discussion with the group and sort of brainstorm together so people don't feel like they're being forced to do something they don't want to do. Unfortunately, I've seen that happen, right? Where you have someone who's totally well-intentioned and maybe they want to do one of those like painting classes, where these, wine and paint classes.
Wine.
Yes. And, and there's half of the staff or half of the team that's super excited and the other half that is just rolling their eyes the whole time. So I think some of it is it's a great opportunity to even build your team figuring out what you're going to do together and how you as a group make decisions. If people are looking just for a lot of ideas to maybe throw out there to your team, again, talking to the team, the paint and wine thing is one. These escape rooms that are kind of coming up now where you have to come up as a group and figure out how you escape this room, and given these little clues and tips you get, you figure out how to escape the room. So it's sort of like brain power together. I had one client that did this. There's, I guess, a ranch in Sandy Valley, and there's all sorts of things about lassoing a horse and all sorts of crazy stuff that but they're built into sort of a team building experience. So it's, but that also depends on, what do people are people athletic and want to kind of get out there and get dirty. So I think, again, it goes back to personality. I really like it when a group does something where if they can create something together, like if you do, one of the things I've seen a group do that I thought was just brilliant was all the executive staff actually decided they were going to make like a pancake breakfast and serve it to the rest of the staff. And this, and it was a larger organization, but I thought that was a really cool idea of sort of flipping roles on their head and sort of they were the servers for the day and we're sort of at your service. And so I think there's some fun ways that probably people can come up with way more creative things than I can, but that just as a team, you brainstorm it and you figure it out and maybe even mix it up a little bit. Maybe this month it's this activity and next month it's that, or next year from now we consider something else. So I think you can kind of give some credit to a lot of people's ideas.
Yeah, I admit I'm always the crotchety one. Like
Are
whenever
you?
there's recommend some sort of team building activity that might I think it's just having done so many of them and having so many of them not be very good. I'm the one that always cringes. But I have done some that I do enjoy, but I think you're right. It really comes back to what the purpose of it is. So is it to determine what people's problem solving skills are, or to figure out who's good at what? Is that it? Or is it really just to get people out of a work setting to be able to have actual human conversations and not conversations about, like, for example, why didn't you fill out your timesheet on time? Or stupid business conversations that people have.
You raise a good point, though, right? What is the intent of it? Because sometimes people are doing this just to do it. And I think people can feel that, and then it doesn't feel purposeful. But if it's, group, we've had some communication challenges these last few months, and we're not communicating with each other. So we're going to sort of do a team building thing that's around communication. This is sort of a totally different for the nonprofits listening, this is just sort of a cool thing to share that a funder did many years ago. But John Ritter and Focus Property Group, back in the heyday when land development was strong, actually they had a company of about 120 people, and they divided the company into, they had grown to a size where not everybody was knowing each other. So they divided the company into 4 teams. Each team got to name itself, and each team was sort of had to come up with their own charity they were going to go support and figure out how they were going to go support them. And they were given so much time to do this, and they were given a small budget to use, but they really had to get resourceful. And then they would come back and present what they did to sort of this panel of judges. It was sort of a kind of a mix of a bunch of reality TV shows, I won't even mention them all, but all the ones we know of that have kind of risen and fallen at the time, though. And so it was like you'd have the executives of the company sitting there listening to what the teams did, and it ended up, and then would say, great, you're the winning team, ABC gets, you're going to get 20 grand for your nonprofit, which I thought was super cool, because it's like they got people from this company who didn't even know each other talking to each other. So now they had new resources within the company, and they were doing sort of corporate social responsibility for good in the community. And I know you're into CSR, and I was like, what a brilliant idea. So I think it's about really being clear on strategy.
Okay, here's another one for you, Stacey. We just had a board retreat, and this one board member is really unhelpful. He talks without listening, he makes really dumb suggestions, and by the end of the retreat, people were just ignoring him. He probably means well, but I'm not quite sure how to handle him. Do we encourage him to resign, or are we stuck with him for 3 years?
Oh, we've all been there, haven't we? And the sad part about these kinds of board members is that it's just painful for everybody in the room, and long term that can have a demoralizing effect and even impact attendance. But I don't think on something like this, the board member is not doing anything super blatant. Generally, bylaws don't say you remove a board member because they're not listening. So I don't think this is as easy as encouraging the board member to resign. I think a really good facilitator can help kind of put things back on track. So I know when I facilitate, oftentimes I will set some ground rules at the beginning that maybe knowing what the group's weaknesses are, or in this case, something about, listen, be an active listener and sort of share a little bit about what that means. So sort of that sets the expectation at the beginning, which sometimes makes people just more aware of it. Mm-hmm. But I also think as a facilitator, and if you don't have a facilitator, if there's someone on the board who can be that person, sometimes it's the board chair who can kind of redirect, or when that odd suggestion or that kind of dumb question comes up, really kind of redirecting that to, Joe Schmo, I think I hear you saying this, and how does that tie to what we just talked about? And not trying to embarrass the person, but sometimes trying to make a connection that maybe others don't see,
Right.
or even just kind of trying to, take that as a nugget to then turn it into a positive. So I think with the right kind of redirection and helping guide conversation, you can help mitigate that a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of want to dig into it a little bit deeper because first of all, was there a facilitator? If there was a facilitator, they weren't doing their job because one of the jobs of the facilitator is to keep everything moving and keep
Absolutely.
everyone sort of on track and using the guidelines properly.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm wondering about is because he's asking really dumb questions, was he not prepared properly? So, if you're going into a strategic planning retreat or whatever, it doesn't say what the retreat was about, but whatever the retreat's about, if nobody knows the purpose of the retreat or why they're there or they haven't done enough research on the issues, yeah, of course their questions are going to sound dumb because they weren't prepared and it's up to them to prepare it.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I was thinking is if it is, there's that weird staff board dynamic that you see every once in a while is that staff members have a tendency not to be able to control board members. Sometimes they feel like they're subservient to
Yes.
them, that the board's
Yes.
the board's the board.
Board's
and
the
they're-
master,
Yeah,
yes.
they're a master and everything they say is right and you have to listen to them and be deferential. But it really is staff's responsibility because they're the ones that are in it every day to make sure that they're surfacing everything that they need to surface and cutting people off if they need to cut them off and acknowledging like, that's a really interesting thing that you're talking about there. I'm not quite sure how it is relevant to the discussion that we're having. Can you help me understand that?
Yes.
And that's something that a facilitator could do. And I think if a staff member felt like that, well, I don't want to irritate, this guy's rich. I don't want to irritate this guy. They might not want to jump in and be honest with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet it helps. I think it's important when we think about board culture, stuff like that can be toxic to board culture. And if it's not addressed, it can be problematic. So definitely kind of coming up with a game plan. And I really like what you said. I mean, preparation. If somebody didn't receive the materials or if, for example, you've got introverts and extroverts, and I can speak from being an introvert. I always want to have time to think through something. Even when we're doing this podcast, I want to see questions in advance.
You don't want to be surprised.
I don't want to be surprised.
We don't want to do a call-in
I'm not great.
show.
Yeah, I'm not great. Like in the moment, off, kind of off the top of my head. And so that could be this situation as well. So it's a little bit like I kind of don't want to shoot that board member down because maybe there's some other things that could be done to kind of channel that energy into something a little better.
Yeah. Hey, at least they're showing up, right?
Yeah, and they're engaging with questions. Hey,
Yeah.
better than a lot.
Exactly.
Well, that's a wrap for today, everybody. Thanks for sticking through this with us. We appreciate you listening and would love for you to recommend this to others. We are eager to hear your questions. So visit nonprofiteverything.com, submit your question. You can even make it anonymous if you don't want to attribute your name. We would just love to hear from you.
Please do that. Please send us anonymous questions that are like
please.
calling out your bosses
Yes.
and your nonprofits.
You would make our lives so much fun. So anyways, and special thanks to Ann, Alliance for Nevada Nonprofits, for being our presenter and organizing this entire podcast. Until next time.